Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Russell T. Warne to discuss the topic of intelligence. Russell is a distinguished educational psychology scholar specializing in research, measurement, and statistics. He holds a PhD from Texas A&M University and served as a faculty member at Utah Valley University for over a decade. Russell's research on human intelligence and giftedness is widely recognized, with numerous publications in esteemed journals such as Psychological Bulletin and Intelligence. Currently, he serves as the chief scientist at Riot IQ, a research team dedicated to the development of a high-quality online intelligence test. Finally, Russell is the author of In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. One takeaway I had from my discussion with Russell is that there is a ton of misinformation about intelligence. Most claims about IQ tests being biased or lacking practical value seem to be driven by a lack of information or subjectivity due to the controversial nature of observing intelligence differences across different groups. Moreover, I feel that the movement towards expanding the definition of intelligence to include categories like musical ability, physical talents, or maybe even social, emotional skills is misguided. In an effort to be inclusive of individuals that don't score high on traditional measures of intelligence, we end up diluting the meaning of the word intelligence. Intelligence refers to our ability to think and reason, but it is just one predictor of success in life. Every human being has the potential to possess strengths that are conceptually distinct from intelligence. We need to be far less critical of ourselves if we happen to score in the bottom half of the intelligence distribution. Lastly, I think that we are making a huge mistake by not leveraging IQ in the structure of our education system. I'm sure that either you, your children, or someone you know has been frustrated in school because a class was either too easy or, on the other hand, moving too quickly. IQ scores provide a quick and easy way to ensure that lesson plans are congruent with student ability. If you've always thought that IQ tests are BS, I hope this episode provides you with some information to think about. Enjoy. All right, today I am joined by Russell Warne. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Appreciate it.
So Russell wrote a book called In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Intelligence. It was a fantastic read, very detailed. I really liked how detailed the book was without being too dense and hard to get through. I thought the writing was fantastic.
Thank you.
And so I asked Russell to come on today to talk about intelligence. So intelligence is something, it's a word that everyone uses perhaps on a daily basis, but it is also a word that has a lot of definitions. People have lots of definitions for intelligence in their own head that may not be consistent with what researchers consider intelligence. So some people think of intelligence as just accumulated knowledge. Maybe some people think it's the ability to solve problems. Right off the top, why don't you give us a definition of intelligence that we can all sort of agree on?
Yeah, I believe that intelligence is best understood as a global overall ability to understand and solve problems, understand one's environment, and to solve problems. That can be applied to a lot of different areas. one of those is learning. And so that's why a lot of people think, oh, intelligence is just the amount of trivia you know. Can you win at Jeopardy? But it goes beyond that. It goes to being able to make connections among different ideas and to reason and to apply one's problem solving ability to many different domains. Every human being has intelligence, and I believe many animals do too. The question is, who is better at this problem solving, who is more effective at this understanding in different environments and for different topics than others, and that's where it gets interesting to me.
And are there widely agreed upon components of intelligence? You talk about a few different versions in your book.
Yeah, we're not fully agreed on what other cognitive abilities out there besides general intelligence help people solve problems, but definitely verbal ability is one of them, which shouldn't be surprising compared to all other animals. Humans are amazing communicators, and our languages are phenomenal in their breadth of what they can talk about. Um, Spatial reasoning is another, being able to understand and to navigate in two and three-dimensional space.
Mhm.
And then what psychologists call fluid reasoning, which is being able to reason about and understand situations regardless of their content or their context. Beyond that, there's going to be more disagreement. I'm a big fan of processing speed. Some of my colleagues are not. Processing speed is your ability to process information quickly. I mean, we're talking on the level sometimes, depending on the task, of milliseconds. And working memory seems to be another one that a lot of people agree is important. And working memory is your ability to keep multiple pieces of information in your mind while also working with them and manipulating those ideas to produce the conclusion. Those are the five I think are the strongest. But I've seen other colleagues argue that mathematical reasoning is a separate ability from fluid reasoning. I've seen others argue for other types of cognitive abilities. Another good example is what we call auditory discrimination. Can you distinguish the difference between different pitches or different sounds? I'm not convinced, but I have some colleagues out there, and I respect them a lot, and they have good reasons for thinking that.
So, after reading your book, I really got this idea that the statistics behind developing these models is very important. And while some of it is sort of in the weeds, multivariate statistics stuff, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how researchers construct this idea of a general intelligence from specific measures. When I was teaching multivariate statistics, I always like to talk about food preferences when we talk about this tool called factor analysis, where you have this idea of I like desserts. I'm a dessert person. Well, what does that mean? I mean, you could ask somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 how much do you like desserts, but if you wanted to get technical, you would ask them on a scale of 1 to 10 how much they like individual desserts. And how much do you like ice cream? How much do you like cinnamon buns? And then statistically, we look to see commonalities amongst those responses, those finite responses. And it seems as though that intelligence needs to be understood in the same way, that we're looking at what is has in common with the individual measures. Could you talk a little bit about that process and how we use it to define intelligence?
Yeah, you said the phrase factor analysis. That's a statistical measure we use to identify general intelligence and also other abilities like verbal ability and things like that are related to general intelligence. They're correlated. Um, your example of finding dessert ratings and other ratings makes real sense. The specific variables, the more correlated they are, the more factor analysis is going to say these variables belong in a group that belong together. We call that group a factor. I would use, when I taught this to undergraduates, the example of a centrifuge. If you put material in a centrifuge and spin it around really fast, it separates out. Denser material falls to the bottom, lighter material rises to the top. That's what fact analysis does. It puts all your data in like a centrifuge and says, okay, here's a grouping that all goes together. Here's another grouping. Here's a third. And it will tell you how much those groups, those factors are related to one another. And the variables or the data within a factor will have much more in common than they will with variables outside that factor. When we do this with cognitive data, we find that there's this overwhelming, it's about half of the relationship of cognitive variables is just all one big factor. We call it G, or general factor, or general intelligence. And that seems to be the big driver of the effectiveness of these tests, is that all of these tasks relate to one another strongly enough that we can say, okay, people are using the same ability to solve an analogies question and to solve a question where they have to rotate an object in
Right.
their mind.
And
Even
most
though these questions don't
importantly, right, I guess the key to understanding that is that they're not independent, right? They're someone, a lay person who is kind of approaching this might it might help to understand it that way, that if you look at someone's performance on a verbal task and their spatial ability, they're rarely independent. They are related. If you know someone's score on spatial ability, you have an idea of what their score is going to be on verbal ability, right?
Yep. They're all positively correlated. So someone who does better than average in verbal analogies is probably also likely going to do better than average in object rotation. Um, and we've never been able to find a cognitive task that doesn't correlate with all the others. And so that's why that's a really strong piece of evidence. The fact that they're all correlating together, they all probably belong to the same group. What's that group? It's really general. Let's call it general intelligence.
So diving more into the measurement process of intelligence, it seems, just in passing, I was talking to a few people about this book, and I very quickly saw that there's a common myth specifically related to the methodological soundness of measuring intelligence. You hear the word biased thrown out a lot. You hear the idea that it only measures good test takers. I like how you structured your book around the idea of myths, because it really made sense when I started to think of it in this sense. Are intelligence tests methodologically sound?
Oh yes, they're the best designed tests in psychology. An intelligence test is far more sophisticated and accurate than a mental health diagnostic test that is supposed to diagnose depression or an anxiety disorder. They're more methodologically sound and accurate than personality tests. The only ones I say might have surpassed intelligence tests in recent decades are academic achievement tests. That field has really been where all the innovations in testing have been for about the past 30 years or so. So if you're interested in how well at the end of the year fourth graders are reading, okay, you probably have a more sophisticated test than the average intelligence test. But that being said, if intelligence tests aren't meeting your needs, if you don't think they're good enough, and they're not perfect, there is no perfect test. But if you don't think that the intelligence tests are good enough, that's okay. But you also need to throw out the personality test and the mental health test and the interest test and all the survey data baby with your bathwater.
So where does this idea of bias come from? Uh, I've specifically heard the criticism that there's a cultural bias, perhaps that when you take an individual and you give them an intelligence test or an IQ test, and they don't perform as well as someone else, that it's common that the reason for that is not that they are less intelligent or have a lower score on this G construct, but rather it is the test items are culturally biased, and you actually discuss this in your book quite a bit.
Yeah, let's first get to the side that sometimes it is inappropriate to give a particular test to a particular person. I have a very good friend who was born in Colombia. He moved to the United States as an adult. For a job he applied for, he had to take an intelligence test, and it was a test in English, designed and normed on native born, native English speaking Americans. And inevitably, there were some verbal questions and things like that. It
Hmm.
wasn't fair to give that to him. And test creators are very clear about who their test is designed for. They'll say, hey, in the case of a Wechsler test, this test is designed for Americans born in the United States who speak English as a native language. And if you give the test to anyone else, all bets are off about the validity of the score. And test creators
Okay.
are very clear about this, which I'm very grateful for. Um, so putting that aside, it's not appropriate, and everyone recognizes this. Assuming a person belongs to the population that the test is designed for, and it's a professionally developed test, um, those accusations of bias are really not well founded, and they can come from a variety of reasons, a variety of sources. I'll bet you one of them is some people don't like their results, and I sympathize with that. I've sometimes have taken a test and said, I think this is too low. I think I'm smarter than that. There's also the fact that we do get average differences across demographic groups sometimes. A really strong example is in spatial reasoning. I'm not aware of a test out there that hasn't shown a large noticeable difference between the average male's performance and the average female's performance, with males doing much better on these spatial reasoning tests. Um, and so there's some people say, well, it must be biased against females. Well, if the test is measuring a real difference that exists, then it can't then that's not evidence of bias. The test may be pointing out a real difference among these people. So that's something to consider. You can't just look at the differences and say, oh, group A scores higher than group B. This must be biased against group B. You have to make sure the test is developed for the group and that it has been professionally developed. And if it's professionally developed, then there have been screenings for item bias, and there have been steps taken to minimize that bias. So that's something to be aware of. Um, and I understand why those accusations are common, but you can't sell a test on the market today without screening for bias. It goes against professional standards. If you did, you would be sued so fast if someone then used your test and it disadvantaged another person. So
Yeah. Yeah, I
I
tried
don't
to explain this to having
worry
worked
about
for a large company who used a lot of surveys and job tests. Yeah, there was a ton of effort that goes into investigating for bias. I think, obviously part of it is going to come from the one of the many, many different casual user intelligence in quotes tests that are on various websites. I mean, in the
Yeah.
last, it's been a while since I've seen, you know, which you can tell how intelligent you are by which Sex and the City character you like, or something silly like that. But I think the average person has is much more likely to have taken some sort of poorly constructed quiz online versus a formal intelligence test.
Yeah. Yeah, but even if it's professionally developed, group average differences are out there, and it's natural to suspect that there might be something wrong with the test. But group differences by themselves are not evidences of bias, although they can be an indication that you should see if the test is biased. So they might be an indication you should investigate it. But the group difference is not the beginning and the end of the discussion. And I understand why that makes people leery of tests, but this is a field that's been in existence for over 100 years. Um, if there were some task out there that every single group scored equally good on average on the task, and it was a great measure of intelligence, we would have found it by now.
Mhm.
There's not some task out there that literally six generations of psychologists have missed.
Right. So,
So I,
yeah.
yeah.
So part of the story with intelligence relates to whether or not this idea, when measured in an individual or a group, can predict anything, right? The cool part of a psychological construct is whether or not we can predict real world outcomes. That's, we love to see that. And so could you talk a little bit about what intelligence can predict in a more practical, in terms of more practical outcomes? Why don't we start with some advantages?
Yeah, and it's a good question to ask because if the score only tells you how well someone does in the testing situation, then it's worthless.
Right, right.
I don't spend most of my life taking tests. I don't think you do either. So, life advantages or positive outcomes that it predicts. Positive intelligence is associated with higher income, higher job prestige, better performance in school. And some of those are not terribly surprising. Well, of course, high IQ predicts how well you do in school.
Right.
The tests were originally designed to be used in the school situation. That's not terribly surprising. We engineered the test to do that. But what I'm more surprised at is how many real life variables these tests predict, even though they were not designed to do so. Last year, an article came out showing that smarter examinees were better marksmen. Their shooting accuracy with guns is better.
Mm-hmm.
No one has ever once designed an intelligence test to predict who would be a better shot, and yet it does anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always impressed by things like that. And we see a lot of that with health outcomes. Smarter people are less likely to have major health problems, die of a heart attack, less likely to be overweight, less likely to die in a car accident. Again, no one designed the test to do these things, but there it is anyway.
And are
Lower
you
likelihood of
now? Are you
divorce.
comfortable saying that? I mean, I know that this is correlational data, but just to give some perspective, do you feel that having this trait of intelligence is causally impacting these outcomes?
We don't always know whether it's causal, and I'm willing to admit that. In fact, sometimes we know it's not,
Right.
at least or not fully causal. Um, we see this sometimes with health outcomes because now we have behavioral geneticists who are way smarter than I am, who are doing some of these studies, trying to figure out what's causal, what's not. And sometimes we're finding that, for example, the same genes that give you a healthy brain are also the same genes that give you a healthy heart. And so smarter people are less likely to have a heart attack.
Interesting.
That doesn't necessarily mean that being smart causes, or if it does,
Right.
it's indirect through the genes. So sometimes we know for a fact that it's not purely causal. Um, but if your question is, well, what does IQ predict? That relationship doesn't have to be causal for us to predict
Mhm.
the relationship. And so I'm just always surprised at the breadth of variables associated with IQ. And even though I've been reading about this for over 15 years, about once a year, once every 2 years, an article comes out. It just blows my mind. And I think, wow, I never thought IQ would correlate with that. And yet it
Mhm.
does.
How about disadvantages? I know that there's this idea floating around that smarter people are less happy. The troubled genius. I know. I mean, I will abstain from estimating my own level of the G factor. But I know at times, sometimes I feel like intellect is somewhat of a burden in the sense that you have to notice everything and be upset with it. In terms of disadvantages, in your book, you have some correlations, um, some variables that are negatively correlated with intelligence. Could you talk about a few of those that you might find interesting?
Yes, a lot of them are the flip side of the coin of the advantages. So lower intelligence is associated with lower income, more likely to be on welfare, higher risk for divorce, higher um, frequency of criminal behavior, etc. One that bucks these trends that I do find a little concerning is that people with higher intelligence are at higher risk for eating disorders. That does seem to be a negative life outcome that's a little bit more common in people with above average intelligence. So it's not all roses. Um, and probably because of shared genes, there's a higher risk of autism spectrum disorder in higher intelligence people. And so, with the eating disorder one, I don't know how much of that is shared genes. I don't know how much of that is the curse of being smart. But it's not always a bed of roses. And as the old song goes, "Mo money, mo problems." Sometimes, if your life is more complex, there can be bigger problems. I haven't seen strong evidence about it, but even though criminality in general is more common in less intelligent people, I suspect that there's certain types of crimes that are more common in high intelligence people, like insider trading, racketeering. I don't even know what racketeering is, so you have to be pretty smart to do it.
Yeah.
Um, but keeping that, the asterisk, I don't have strong data about it. It's just I look at these types of things and think you've got to be pretty smart to engage in, you know, certain types of embezzlement, and smarter people are probably going to be more likely to be in that situation.
Well,
I don't have proof for that.
I know that magicians will commonly say that intelligent people make the best uh, audience for a magic trick because in order to be amazed by a magic trick, you have to follow the logical progression of activities that are going on with the trick. If you miss something, or if you don't even clock a logical, that coin is not supposed to be there, right? That intelligent people are harder or much easier to fool and better audiences for magic. So perhaps that's along the same lines as the idea
I
that they
don't
might.
know. It's plausible,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't want people to think, oh, life is, you're on easy street if you're smart. Well, no, and all these are just tendencies. There's always exceptions.
Right.
Divorce is a good example. Sometimes the smart thing to do is to get out of a marriage if there's abuse or other problems. So there's always exceptions. But the general exception to the rule, like I said, are things like eating disorders. I suspect certain types of crimes. But in general, yeah, it seems to be better to be smart than not.
Now, one of my favorite parts of the book was how you talked about intelligence and how it relates to some other concepts that a lot of people talk about in education and psychology. So let's start with multiple intelligences. This is something that is it still exists probably in lots of different psychology courses. It's a very specific theory, this idea that there are independent I don't know if the theory claims that they're independent, but the idea that there are intelligences in very specific areas that go beyond cognition. So music, there's an athletic type of intelligence. So these ideas clearly exist in the sense that there are some people that are probably better at physical activities and learning new physical activities, or probably people that are better at learning music and understanding how to improve at music. But in your book, you talk about how this idea doesn't have a lot of evidence. Could you talk about how multiple intelligences might exist as an idea, but not statistically?
Yeah, this idea really comes from Howard Gardner, who is an educational psychologist at Harvard. He wrote a popular book called Frames of Mind, 1983, and he proposed that there were seven, and he did say they were independent, completely independent modules, intelligences in the mind, linguistic, musical, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, etc. And some of these correspond to some of the cognitive abilities that mainstream intelligence theorists believe in. I think that there's a lot of overlap between his linguistic intelligence and what I call verbal ability. Where we disagree is I look at it and say all these abilities correlate with one another, and factor analysis every single time shows that there's this general ability that
Mm-hmm.
causes someone who is able to handle words to also more likely to be able to handle logic. And he says no, they're independent. Um, it's not a well supported theory. In fact, I think there's more evidence that elves exist than multiple intelligences. And the biggest problem that Gardner has is that even when people have tried to create tests and tasks that show that these abilities are separate, they correlate anyway, and people who are good at one tend to be good at others.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest statistical problem. There's
Right.
also theoretical problems like why would you say that bodily kinesthetic intelligence, the ability, for example, to pole vault or to run 100 meters or to do a hip hop dance, why would you say that that's cognitive the same way that solving a logic problem is?
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's the first person in the world who thought that slam dunking a basketball was cognitive. It's not. And so, I mean, stretch the word intelligence to accommodate anything, and pretty soon, yeah, there are some things that are uncorrelated.
Well,
But
on that same note of so
that's just
I-
playing word
I've
games.
well, right. So I noticed that you know that it seems as though the general public pushes back on this idea of general intelligence because it's narrow, and there's a feeling that I get that the general public wants to say, well, this doesn't you're not measuring what I'm good at, right? This obviously there's a self-serving piece here, and it transitions nicely into what I was going to talk about next, which is this idea of street smarts or practical intelligence, and that's something distinct from general intelligence. um, uh, how would you characterize this idea that whatever we're calling intelligence now, the components that you talked about up front, how do we know that those are the components and that it shouldn't include a few more? What is the logic that goes into saying, this is what we think is intelligence versus this is what we should exclude?
Well, there are a couple ways to go about that, and that's a legitimate question, a legitimate criticism, and it was a big topic of conversation among scientists and philosophers in the 20th century. There's a couple things. Number one is if you believe that there is an ability out there, you have to be able to what we call operationalize. You have to be able to give it a definition that allows it to be observed and measured. And so we often see with these other candidates, practical intelligence, street smarts. The operationalizations are often vague or they're extremely specific to one context. One of the big proponents of practical intelligence, Robert Sternberg, um, one of his big articles that he rests his theory on is this study of the practical intelligence of bank tellers at a job, and he says, "Oh, look, this test I have of bank teller tacit knowledge that they picked up is separate from their IQ," and it's like, okay, great. Um, does being a bank teller and that practical intelligence matter for being a delivery driver or a stay-at-home parent or whatever? It's like, fine, you can invent a specific idea or construct for a specific environment and it won't matter to anyone outside of it. So that's one issue with these operationalizations, or often the operationalizations will be very vague. Wisdom is one we see a lot. Um, and it'll be so vague that um, it's not useful to study scientifically. And if you can't operationalize and measure it, it's not a useful scientific construct. So that's a big strike that a lot of them have against them. The other one of abilities that, where do we draw the line, comes up in what's cognitive and what's not. To psychologists, what's cognitive, it's obvious. It's whatever you have to use your brain to figure out. And so we see a lot of people, and Gardner is a good example, saying, well, athletic abilities can be cognitive, bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Um, that's a really hard argument to make, especially because so many tasks that psychologists have developed that don't look cognitive are. A good example is reaction time. Doesn't look cognitive, but smarter people have faster reaction times. And sorry, speaking of reaction time, a bug just crawled on my arm and I had to react to that.
Now stop showing off. Now you're just showing off.
Yeah. um, you know, but that difference is on the level of milliseconds. It pops up again and again. It does predict how well people do more complex things. That's not true with running the 100 meters or slam dunking a basketball or succeeding at the long jump. Those things don't seem to correlate with any important life outcomes outside of that domain. Okay, quarterbacks, candidates at the NFL combine who can run the 40 yards really fast also tend to be faster wide receivers. Well, okay, yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. But the faster athlete at the combine is not also the straight A student and the better decision maker. But you can say that about simple reaction time of pressing a button when you see a light. You can say that about how fast people can find all of the A's on a page and cross them out.
Right.
And so that's the other thing is that, okay, you think that this other ability that is measurable is an intelligence. show me how it relates to intelligent, outcomes we would expect, and they don't.
Hmm.
They
That
don't.
helps. I think that that definitely helps to understand the value and sort of the criteria that goes into developing these components and items. It also makes sense why there would be some debate around just how the components that some experts include and some don't, because it depends on what outcome it correlates it relates to. Some might predict one outcome, and someone might think, "Oh, that's super important." And another might not correlate, and the argument would be, well, it's who cares if it predicts, income, for example. There's
Yeah.
lots of factors
Well,
that play into
and
income.
that's what's so surprising is you can engineer a test to maximize its predictive power for a certain outcome. In fact, sometimes you want to do that.
Right, right.
Job performance tests are an example. I want the best possible engineer, so I'm going to manufacture a test that focuses only on engineering job performance. And I don't care whether it correlates with other stuff, but we find time and time again that those tests still correlate with these other things like income and not dying in a car wreck. And that
Mhm.
is a major distinction between what psychologists consider cognitive and what people like Howard Gardner or the layman say, well, why not athletic ability? Why can't that be an intelligence? Well, because it doesn't seem to correlate with anything that you would expect an intelligence to correlate with.
Right.
And if you say, well, I still like calling it intelligence, that's just playing word games.
Yeah.
Um, you're in Lewis Carroll's domain. Whatever you want to call something, is different from what I want to call it. And
Mhm.
my definition is better than yours. No, you can't play word games in science.
I want to talk about the ideas of grit and related growth mindset. So there's a popular narrative that has been put forth over the last 20 years or so, basically establishing that when you look at things like academic achievement and other types of success, that you have an ability that describes your acumen. Maybe it is synonymous with intelligence, but then right next to that is your motivation, your perseverance and persistence that sits kind of that's sort of added on top of that. And that if you have that, ability is important, but what's more important is that maybe you don't have that high score on an ability for a task, but your drive, and that variable is also a strong predictor, or even a stronger predictor of your ability. You address this in the book. Could you kind of give an overview as to if you feel that that narrative is correct?
Yeah, I will say it is partially correct. For all these positive life outcomes, there's not a single one where IQ is the only thing that matters.
Right.
Income is a good example. No one's paid to just sit around and be smart. Even college professors or theoretical physicists or other people have to do something with their time. They have to produce some sort of
Right.
outcome for their employer. Um, and often being able to do that does require motivation and other things. And so let's look at the grain of truth in it. Yes, you want to be successful at a high prestige occupation. Yes, you also need to be motivated. You also need to be focused. You also need to have determination, some of these other things. But yeah, the claim that we see, for example, in Angela Duckworth's work on grit, that grit is more important than IQ, hasn't held up empirically. Um, I will say this about grit. Um, there does seem to be an independent um, it does seem to be independent of IQ, and it does seem to be a good mix of motivation plus some personality traits. I don't think it's new.
Mhm.
Psychology's been around now for almost 150 years. I'm always really skeptical when someone says, I've discovered a new mental trait
Yeah.
that has never heretofore been found. And I'm thinking, really? You had this purse capacity to find this and no one else did for 150 years? I'm really skeptical about that. So I don't think grit is independent. I don't think it's new. I do think it's a mix of motivation and certain personality traits like conscientiousness. And when you have well-designed studies, it doesn't seem to be more important than IQ. That being said, I want my kids to have a stick-to-itiveness and to tough it out when the going gets rough. Um, there's a little bit of old-fashioned American gumption behind this that pays off in life.
Yeah, and you talk
Um,
about that because it's extremely important to have perspective about this particular topic, um, because in your book you talk about there is a genetic piece to intelligence. And it's fascinating because oftentimes when you start saying, well, uh, this concept of intelligence is genetic, there's a big genetic piece. A lot of people hear, well, then it's unchangeable. And in your book, you talk about how important it is to focus on that, the half that is malleable versus the half that is fixed. It's so important to have perspective about these types of things. Um, Talk for a moment about how we know that there's a genetic component to intelligence, and more specifically, how do you uncouple? The hard part seems to be, how do you uncouple that there's a genetic influence from upbringing and the environment that you grow up in.
yeah, just as background, we normally find that approximately 50% of the differences in intelligence among people are due to their genetic differences or associated with their genetic differences, and about 50% is due to environmental differences. A little too technical to talk about that, but the important thing to realize is a group level statistic talking about differences. I can't crack open your head and say, aha, here's the half of your intelligence specifically that came from your genes. Um, so even though these are group level statistics, it can be very tempting to apply them to individuals and say, oh, in my country in adults, IQ 70% genetics. Why bother with the other 30%? Well, we don't know about you specifically. And then context matters too. In wealthy countries, every child almost is subjected to an education, and unless you're locked in a closet for your whole life, you're exposed to generally an environment that's better than compared to what humans historically have had. Um, and so you need an environment also that is conducive to allowing those genetic differences to show up. If you locked every child in a box, then you're not giving their genes a chance to manifest themselves, and everyone comes out looking equally stupid.
Right.
But we have an environment in the United States where every child by law has to go to school. Most people go to school for much longer than their grandparents, let alone their great grandparents or their distant ancestors went. And that allows the genes to manifest themselves. So there's this beautiful interplay between environment and genes. You have to have the right environment for the genes to manifest themselves. In turn, people, because of their genes, put them in environments where they tend to feel comfortable. I'm short. I'm about 5'7". I haven't played basketball in decades. Why? Well, because I'm awkward and uncomfortable. And Tall people immediately, block my
Right.
shots without thinking twice.
Hmm.
My genes get me not to go on the basketball court. Um, and so we have this interplay. And that's why that percentage only applies to groups. And we know that intelligence is approximately 50% genetic, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on different things. Because we find that genetic relatives, even if they've never met, maybe one was adopted away or another died, um, are much more similar to one another than strangers are. Or when we have people who are adopted into families that they're not genetically related to, their IQs, and by the time they reach adolescence or adulthood, adopted children's IQs have zero correlation with their adoptive family members,
Mm.
but they're positively correlated with their biological family members' IQs. And so that tells us really
Yeah.
powerfully, wow, genes matter a lot. Because even adopted children who have never met their parents have IQs that are more similar to their biological parents than to their adopted parents. And that's amazing.
So, towards the end of the book, you make a strong case for why we should not ignore the construct of intelligence because there's so much value that we can gain from considering it in terms of policy making in schools, for example. Um, to wrap up, could you give some perspective on how you think intelligence should be, how the idea of intelligence should be used to inform public policy, to inform perhaps how we could make improvements in schools and education?
Oh yeah, certainly. And I am an educational psychologist. So that's where I see the most policy implications. I think one of the worst things that's happened from ignoring intelligence is the blame game. Johnny can't read. Oh, well, the teacher says it's mom and dad's fault for not reading to him every night before bed. And the parents say, no, it's the teacher's fault for not teaching him well enough. And the principal comes in the meeting and says, no, it's the kid's fault. He's not applying himself. And maybe Johnny was unfortunately dealt a bad genetic hand and is going to struggle to read even under the best of conditions. It's no one's fault that he has those genes. The parents didn't handpick the genes and pass on dyslexia genes or low IQ genes to him. Um, it's not his fault he got those. The teacher didn't have anything to do with that. The principal did. And so once you stop playing the blame game, it's now okay. Well, how can we help this person? It's now much more a story of compassion. And I see that in a lot of things. I also see ignoring intelligence as encouraging a lot of bad policies. A good example is AP for all, the idea that every child should have AP classes. No, they're challenging classes. You throw every child into them, and suddenly you have a child with an IQ of 75, 80 trying to master AP literature, college level literature. No, this child would be much more successful in a remedial English class and maybe a trade or an arts class or something else that they can enjoy. And that might give them some skills or some life benefits later. Um, so that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's a whole nother podcast about
Yeah.
policy intelligence.
Well, the
Um,
the interesting thing about in the context of education, obviously, there's a lot of debate around do you, do you create small groups of students with similar IQ. Because on one hand, it seems to me, my gut instinct is that that's a fantastic idea, but some might argue that if you draw these circles or you make these tiers based on someone's IQ, those students in the bottom tier, they're not going to be exposed to higher level concepts. They're not going to socialize with students that are of higher IQ, which could, theoretically foster them along. Just, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's a debate that's been going on in education in the United States. Gosh, for over 130, 140 years.
Yeah.
Um, there are ways to we call that ability grouping. There's ways to do it right and there's ways to do it wrong. I'll give you a good example of a wrong way. My wife told me that when she was a kid in elementary school, only the kids in the gifted class were allowed to do the school play, which is completely stupid.
All right.
um, if a kid wants an arts opportunity, why should they have to score high on some sort of academic aptitude test? That's stupid. Any kid who wants to should be able to be in the school choir or audition for the play. So there are ways to do it bad. And I think that the way we do ability grouping in the US in middle and high school is a lot more palatable, where there's different classes. Okay, for gym and for choir, it's kids of all abilities mixed together. But sorry, if you're in seventh grade, not all of you can take Algebra 1 this year.
Yeah.
Some of you need pre algebra, and some of you need a basic math course. And so I like subject by subject ability grouping, and I like ability groupings that are reevaluated regularly. I don't like the idea of what New York City does, for example. We'll test a preschooler with an intelligence test, and if they score high, we'll admit them to the gifted program in kindergarten, and they get to stay in it their whole K to 12 years. No. I like the idea of evaluating every semester or every year or however long it's feasible for the school and say, okay, who is not benefiting from this? Let's pull them out of the advanced English and into regular English. Hey, who in the regular English class needs to be challenged more? Let's put that. And I like the idea of being flexible. So there's ways you can do it right, there's ways you can do it wrong. But that's true with any intervention, educational, medical.
Yeah. Well, I think your next book should be about how to maximize the value of education. But the current book is called In the Know: Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence. Pick it up wherever books are sold. It was absolutely fantastic, and it has a lot more information than what we talked about today. Thank you so much for joining me, Russell Warne.
You're welcome, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
For more on Russell, visit russellwarne.com. That's RussellWarne.com. Also, go pick up a copy of In the Know: Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, wherever books are sold. Lastly, visit riotiq.com to learn more about Russell's efforts to develop a high-quality online intelligence test. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to Patreon to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTPod. As always, feel free to email me with comments or guest suggestions at whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?